The men at Copper Barrel Shooting Club thought they knew exactly what they were dealing with when Zariah Monroe walked through their doors. Just another outsider who didn't belong in their elite world of precision rifles and military brotherhood. So, when they handed her a broken weapon and laughed as it malfunctioned, when they whispered jokes about beauty pageants and nail salons, when Colonel Harrow himself warned her that she was nothing more than a distraction, they believed they had successfully put this quiet black woman in her place. But what none of these decorated veterans and weekend warriors realized was that they had just humiliated the sole survivor of Taskwind Zero, a ghost who had spent 3 years hunting the very men who murdered her team in Syria. And in exactly 14 seconds, Zariah was going to remind them all that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt as Zariah Monroe's battered Ford pickup rolled into Stratton, Arizona. The truck's paint had faded from navy blue to something closer to gray, and the engine made a sound that suggested it might give up at any moment. Behind her sunglasses, Zariah's dark eyes swept across the dusty main street, taking in the handful of storefronts, the weathered faces of locals who paused their conversations to stare at the newcomer. She pulled into the parking lot of a small diner called the Pit Stop. The sign out front was sun-bleached and crooked, advertising best coffee in 50 miles in faded red letters. Zariah sat in the truck for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. Through the diner's windows, she could see people inside, their heads already turning in her direction. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they certainly quieted. Zariah made her way to the counter where a heavy-set woman with graying hair looked up from wiping down coffee cups. "Help you with something, honey?" the woman asked, her voice carrying the rough kindness of someone who'd spent decades serving coffee to truckers and locals. "Looking for work," Zariah said simply. "Saw the help wanted sign." The woman, whose name tag read Dolores, studied her for a moment. "You got experience?" "Some." "Well, we need someone who can handle the morning rush and won't run off after a week. Pays not much, but tips are decent if you're friendly enough." Dolores paused, glancing at the other customers who were still stealing looks at Zariah. "You sure you want to work in a place like this? Folks around here can be set in their ways." Zariah's expression remained neutral. "I've worked in worse places." That first week passed quietly. Zariah served coffee, took orders, and cleaned tables without much conversation beyond what was necessary. But she listened. She listened to the ranchers complaining about cattle prices, to the truckers griping about new regulations, and especially to the group of men who came in every Tuesday and Thursday morning, dressed in expensive outdoor gear and talking loudly about something called Copper Barrel. "Jake put 3 shots in the center ring from 300 yards yesterday," one of them was saying, his voice carrying across the diner. "Kid's got talent." "Still nothing compared to what Gideon can do," another replied. "Man's got nerves of steel. Been to 3 tours, you know." Zariah refilled their coffee cups without comment, but she noticed how they carried themselves. The way they sat, the way they watched people enter and leave. These weren't just weekend warriors playing with guns. These men had training. On her first day off, Zariah drove the 20 minutes out to Copper Barrel Shooting Club. The facility sat on a rise overlooking the desert, a collection of low buildings surrounded by various shooting ranges. The main building was impressive for a rural club, with large windows and what looked like expensive stonework. Several luxury trucks and SUVs filled the parking lot. The interior was even more impressive. Polished wood paneling, mounted animal heads, and glass cases filled with vintage firearms. Everything about the place screamed money and exclusivity. Behind the front desk, a young man with perfectly styled hair looked up as Zariah approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew she didn't belong. "I'd like to register for shooting lessons," Zariah said. The young man's eyebrows raised slightly. He glanced toward a group of older men standing near a display case of rifles. One of them, a stocky man with a gray beard and military tattoos covering his forearms, had noticed the exchange. "Hey, Tyler," the bearded man called out, loud enough for half the club to hear. Ain't the beauty pageant down the road? Laughter erupted from the group. Zariah didn't flinch, didn't even turn to look at them. She kept her eyes on Tyler behind the desk. Sorry about that, Tyler said, though his smile suggested he found it amusing. That's Jed Walsh. He's colorful. He reached under the counter and pulled out some paperwork. Here's what you'll need to fill out. Zariah looked down at the forms. The header read, Copper Barrel Janitorial Services, Employment Application. I think there's been a mistake, she said quietly. I'm here for shooting lessons. Tyler glanced at the papers as if seeing them for the first time. Oh, wow, sorry about that. Must have grabbed the wrong stack. More laughter from Jed's group. Tyler's grin widened. Let me get you the right forms. This time he handed her the correct paperwork, but as she began to read through it, he cleared his throat. I should mention, we require all new members to pass a basic qualification shoot before we can assign an instructor. It's just to assess your current skill level. That's fine, Zariah said. Great. We have some club firearms you can use for the test. No need to bring your own equipment. 20 minutes later, Zariah found herself on the range with a rusted .22 rifle that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. The scope was loose, and when she worked the bolt, it stuck halfway. Jed and several other club members had gathered to watch, their arms crossed, smirks plastered across their faces. Take your time, sweetheart, Jed called out. We know this might be your first time handling a real firearm. Zariah chambered around and raised the rifle to her shoulder. The moment she pulled the trigger, she knew something was wrong. The rifle jerked violently in her hands. The bolt flew open and the scope came completely loose, clattering to the ground. Well, that's a shame, Jed said, not bothering to hide his amusement. Looks like you're out of your depth here, sweetheart. Maybe you should stick to nail salons and book clubs. The other men chuckled and began to disperse. Zariah set the broken rifle down carefully and turned to leave. As she walked past the group, she heard one of them mutter, Should have stayed. At the salon, sweetheart. She didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing any reaction. But as she reached her truck, she noticed a woman standing near the entrance, watching. The woman was probably in her 30s, with short, blonde hair and the kind of athletic build that suggested serious training. Unlike the men, she wasn't smiling. She was studying Zariah with curious, intelligent eyes. Their gazes met for just a moment before the woman turned and walked back into the building. That evening, Zariah stopped by Murphy's Bar, the only drinking establishment in Stratton that didn't look like it would collapse in a strong wind. The place was dimly lit and smelled of stale beer and cigarettes, despite the no-smoking signs on every wall. She ordered a beer and found a quiet corner booth where she could observe without being noticed. She didn't have to wait long. About an hour after she arrived, 2 men entered who immediately commanded attention. The first was tall and lean, with graying hair and the kind of posture that screamed military officer. The second was younger, probably early 40s, with dark hair and cold eyes that seemed to catalog every person in the room. They took a table near the bar, and even from across the room, Zariah could hear their conversation clearly. So what do you think of the new girl? The older man asked. Won't last a week, the younger one replied. Probably be gone by the weekend. The older man smiled. Let her try, Gideon. It'll be fun to watch her fail. Zariah finished her beer and left, but not before catching the older man's name when the bartender addressed him. Colonel Harrow. Back in her rented trailer on the outskirts of town, Zariah went through her nightly routine. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, closed the curtains, and then cleared a space in the small living room. For the next hour, she practiced dry-fire drills with an empty pistol, her movements precise and fluid. Her form was perfect, each motion economical and purposeful. When she finished, she knelt beside her bed and pulled out a locked metal case. Inside, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a military dog tag. The name read, Monroe, Z. And underneath it, a photo of 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, their faces young and confident. Zariah was in the center, her arm around a tall man with captain's bars on his collar. She stared at the photo for a long time before putting everything away. The next morning, Zariah drove to Henderson's gun shop, a small store on the edge of town that looked like it had been there since the 1970s. The owner, Ray Henderson, was a thin man in his 60s with knowing eyes and hands that had clearly seen their share of work. "Help you find something?" he asked as she browsed the selection of rifle parts. "Need to build something for long-range work," Zariah said, examining a precision barrel. "Nothing fancy, just reliable." Ray studied her. "For a moment. You know what you're doing?" "Some. Most folks around here just want something loud and impressive. You're looking at parts for a rifle that'll shoot groups you could cover with a quarter at 200 yards. He paused. "People around here don't much. Like different, especially skilled and different." Zariah met his gaze. "I'm not trying to impress anyone." Ray nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but you be careful. This town's got some dark corners, and some folks don't like light being shined in them." Over the next few days, Zariah began practicing in the desert outside town. She'd found an old mining road that led to a natural bowl in the landscape, hidden from view. Using discarded beer bottles and cans she'd collected, she set up targets at various distances. She constructed a simple shooting rest from rocks and used a worn rangefinder to measure distances precisely. Her accuracy was devastating. At 100 yards, she could hit a bottle cap. At 300 yards, she could group shots inside a 2-inch circle. She timed herself constantly, pushing for speed without sacrificing precision. What she didn't know was that someone was watching. Hidden on a ridge nearly a mile away, a man with military-grade binoculars observed every shot. After an hour, he pulled out a satellite phone and made a call. "She's active," he said quietly. "Looks like the ghost came back." The memory came without warning, triggered by the smell of diesel fuel from a passing truck as Zariah walked to work. Suddenly, she wasn't on the dusty streets of Stratton anymore. She was back in Syria, the acrid taste of smoke and concrete dust filling her mouth. The building was 3 stories tall, and Zariah was positioned on the roof of a structure 2 blocks away. Through her scope, she could see the target building clearly. Her radio crackled to life. "Overwatch, this is ground team. We're in position." "Copy, ground team. I have visual on all entry points. No movement on the 2nd floor. 3rd floor shows. 2 heat signatures in the northwest corner. Acknowledged. Moving in now." Zariah watched through her scope as her team approached the building. Captain Bradley was in the lead, followed by Sergeants Collins and Parker, with Specialists Morrison and Hayes bringing up the rear. These were her people. She'd trained with them, eaten with them, trusted them with her life more times than she could count. "Ground floor is clear," Bradley's voice came through the radio. "Moving to 2nd level." "Copy. Still no movement on your floor. 3rd floor signatures remain stationary." That's when everything went wrong. The explosion wasn't from inside the building. It came from above, a precision airstrike that turned the 3-story structure into a crater in less than 2 seconds. The blast was so intense that Zariah was knocked flat on her rooftop position, her ears ringing, debris raining down around her. "Ground team, report!" she screamed into her radio. "Ground team, do you copy?" Nothing but static. "Ground team, please. Respond!" Still nothing. She'd remained in that position for 3 hours, calling their names over and over until her voice gave out, until the rescue teams arrived and pulled her away from the scope she'd been clutching like a lifeline. Back in her trailer, Zariah shook off the memory and reached for a manila folder she kept hidden under her mattress. Inside was a psychological evaluation stamped with red ink. Dishonorable discharge. Culpable for mission failure. Her photo was paperclipped to the top, along with a note in handwriting she recognized. Operator compromised friendly forces through negligent intelligence gathering. The evaluation detailed her inability to provide accurate Overwatch intelligence and failure to identify imminent threat to ground personnel. It was signed by Colonel Harrow. Zariah lit a match and held it to the corner of the paper. As the flames consumed the lies, she made a promise to the ashes. Not this time. The next day, Sophie Hale appeared at the pit stop during the lunch rush. She ordered coffee and a sandwich and took a seat at the counter. When Zariah brought her order, Sophie looked up with those same intelligent eyes from the shooting club. "You're the new waitress," Sophie said. It wasn't a question. Guilty as charged. "I'm Sophie. I saw you at Copper Barrel the other day." Zariah continued wiping down the counter, not making eye contact. "Did you enjoy the show?" "Not particularly." Sophie took a sip of her coffee. "Can I ask you something? Why shooting? I mean, why that particular hobby?" Zariah paused in her cleaning. "Better to shoot at targets than punch customers." Sophie laughed, but there was something deeper in her expression. "That's not really an answer. It's the only one I've got." Zariah moved to clean the next section of counter, but Sophie's voice stopped her. "My brother's Gideon Hale. He's one of the instructors at Copper Barrel." Now Zariah did look at her. "That's supposed to mean something to me?" "Maybe. Maybe not. But I know what I saw the other day, and those men underestimated you. That could be dangerous for everyone involved." A week later, Zariah returned to Copper Barrel. This time, she didn't ask to register for lessons. Instead, she requested permission to observe the advanced sessions. Tyler at the front desk seemed surprised but didn't object. She found a spot on the observation deck overlooking the main range and watched as Gideon Hale demonstrated a high-speed precision shooting drill. He was good, Zariah had to admit. His movements were efficient, his breathing controlled. He engaged 12 targets at varying distances in just under 30 seconds. What the observers didn't notice was that Zariah was timing him with a small digital watch hidden in her palm. 30 seconds exactly. She studied his technique, noting the slight pause before each shot, the way he favored his right eye, how he shifted his weight during transitions. After the demonstration, Colonel Harrow approached her. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd appeared in the bar. His gray eyes were the color of winter storms, and when he smiled, it didn't reach them. "Miss Monroe, isn't it?" he said, extending his hand. "I'm Colonel Marcus Harrow, club president." "Colonel, I understand you've been having some difficulties with our qualification process. Equipment malfunctioned." Harrow's smile widened. "Of course it did. Well, I want you to know that you're welcome to observe our sessions anytime. We believe in being inclusive here at Copper Barrel." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like a challenge. "However," he continued, "I should mention that you seem to be something of a distraction to our members. If you were to step out of line in any way, you'd be asked to leave. Permanently." Zariah met his gaze steadily. "I'm used to not being wanted, sir." "I'm sure you are." Harrow's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Enjoy the rest of your visit." Meanwhile, Sophie was having her own doubts about Zariah. The woman's reaction to the sabotaged rifle had been too controlled, too professional. Normal people got frustrated or angry when equipment failed. They didn't calmly assess the damage and walk away without a word. Sophie had contacts in the military from her own brief stint in the army before she'd gotten out to care for her sick mother. She made a call to a tech sergeant she'd known at Fort Bragg. "I need you to look someone up for me," she said. "Zariah Monroe. Probably served in the last 10 years. Soph, you know I can't just go fishing through personnel files. Please, Jake, it's important." There was a long pause. "Give me a few days. And you owe me big time for this." The call came 3 days later while Sophie was at the gun range practicing her own shooting. She stepped outside to take it. "Sophie, what the hell are you mixed up in?" Jake's voice was tense. "What do you mean?" Zariah Monroe was in a unit called Taskwind Zero, Black Ops, deep cover. Her records have been scrubbed so clean they barely exist, and what's left is buried under classification levels I can't even access. Sophie felt her stomach drop. What happened to her? I don't know. But whatever it was, someone wanted her erased from the system completely. The only reason I found anything at all is because a friend of mine in intelligence owed me a favor. That evening, Sophie was working late at the diner when a customer got aggressive with Zariah. He was drunk, probably coming off a 3-day bender, and he'd been getting increasingly belligerent throughout his meal. "Coffee's cold," he slurred, slamming his cup down on the counter hard enough to rattle the sugar dispenser. "I'll get you." "A fresh cup," Zariah said calmly, reaching for the coffee pot. Don't want a fresh cup. Want this one hot. He grabbed Zariah's wrist as she poured. You people don't listen, do you? What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Zariah twisted her wrist in a way that forced the man to release his grip, while simultaneously using her free hand to pin his arm to the counter, in a joint lock that would have made a martial arts instructor proud. The drunk went from aggressive to gasping in pain before he even realized what had happened. The coffee is hot now, Zariah said quietly, releasing him. Enjoy your meal. The man stared at her for a moment, nursing his wrist, then threw a 20 on the counter and stumbled out. Sophie had watched the entire exchange from the kitchen doorway, and what she'd seen confirmed her worst fears. That was not the reaction of a waitress. That was the reaction of someone with serious combat training. By the time Sophie turned around to say something, Zariah had already disappeared through the back exit. The next morning, Sophie confronted her in the parking lot behind the diner. "Burry, need to talk," Sophie said. Zariah stopped walking but didn't turn around. "About what?" "About who you really are." Now Zariah did turn, and Sophie saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of weary resignation. "I served," Zariah said simply. "That's all you need to know." Taskwind Zero. Zariah's expression didn't change, but Sophie caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "That name doesn't mean anything to me. Jake says it was Black Ops, says your records were scrubbed. Your friend Jake should be more careful about what he goes looking for." Sophie stepped closer. "Look, I don't know what happened to you or what you're doing here, but I know my brother. I know Colonel Harrow. Whatever you're planning, these men aren't just playing weekend warrior. They're hiding something, and if you're not careful, you're going to get yourself killed." For a long moment, the two women stared at each other. Finally, Zariah spoke. "What makes you think I'm planning anything? Because people don't come to places like this by accident, especially not people with your particular set of skills." Zariah was quiet for so long that Sophie thought she wasn't going to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the only way to find the truth is to let people think they've won." The next day, Colonel Harrow called Zariah personally to extend an invitation to a special event at Copper Barrel. "It's an exclusive gathering," he explained over the phone. "Only for our most dedicated members, and those who show exceptional promise." "What kind of event?" "A competition of sorts. A chance to prove yourself among peers. Think you're up for it?" Zariah stared out the window of her trailer at the desert beyond. Somewhere out there, her team was buried in graves that didn't bear their names. Somewhere out there, the truth was waiting. "I'll be there," she said. The invitation to Colonel Harrow's special event had arrived at the diner 2 days later, delivered by a clean-cut young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a military recruitment poster. Sophie watched from behind the coffee machine as Zariah read the simple white card with its embossed gold lettering. "What's that about?" Sophie asked during a brief lull in the dinner rush. Zariah slipped the card into her apron pocket. "Your brother's boss wants to play games." "The elite trials," Sophie said quietly, glancing around to make sure no other customers were listening. "I've heard Gideon mention them." "What do you know?" Sophie wiped down a coffee cup, buying herself time to think. "They're not just shooting competitions. They're tests for people with certain backgrounds. Military, law enforcement, private security. Some of the challenges are legal. Others..." She shrugged. "Let's just say they don't always follow conventional rules of engagement." "What kind of challenges?" "Hostage scenarios, urban warfare simulations. Sometimes they bring in actual criminals who've agreed to participate in exchange for reduced sentences." Sophie's voice dropped even lower. "Gideon came home with a lot of money after the last one, more than his instructor's salary should provide." That weekend, Zariah arrived at Copper Barrel to find the facility transformed. The main building was closed to regular members, and temporary structures had been erected throughout the property. Men in tactical gear moved equipment between stations, their movements precise and professional. This wasn't a weekend warrior competition. This was something else entirely. Colonel Harrow greeted her at the registration table. his smile sharp as a blade. "Miss Monroe, delighted you could join us. I think you'll find today's activities quite educational." He handed her a packet containing a schedule, waiver forms, and a numbered competitor's bib. "You'll be paired with Marcus Webb for the first challenge. He's quite experienced, so don't feel bad if you can't keep up." Webb turned out to be a stocky man in his 30s, with the kind of swagger that came from too many easy victories. He looked Zariah up and down when they were introduced, his expression making it clear what he thought of his chances. "Hope you can handle yourself, sweetheart," he said, checking his gear with exaggerated care. "This ain't like the movies." The first challenge was a timed hostage simulation set up in a mock building constructed from shipping containers. The scenario was straightforward. Neutralize 3 armed hostiles while avoiding harm to 2 civilian targets. Each team had 5 minutes to complete the course. As they waited for their turn, Zariah noticed Webb doing something with his equipment. He was positioned so his body blocked her view, but she caught a glimpse of him adjusting something on her rifle's scope mount. When he moved away, he was smiling. "Ladies first," he said, gesturing toward the starting line. The course began in near darkness. Zariah entered the first container and immediately felt the scope shift loose on her rifle. Webb had loosened the mounting screws just enough to throw off her accuracy without making it obvious. She could hear him moving through the adjacent container, probably taking his time to ensure he'd finish well ahead of her. What Webb didn't know was that Zariah had trained for equipment failures. She quickly removed the scope entirely and switched to iron sights, adjusting her shooting technique accordingly. The targets were closer than optimal for precision work, but within effective range for skilled shooting. The first hostile target appeared from behind a barrier. Zariah's shot took its center mass. The second target was partially concealed behind a civilian cutout. She angled her shot to avoid the hostage and dropped the threat. The third target was positioned at the far end of the container, using a second civilian as a human shield. Zariah took a breath, steadied herself, and fired. The shot was perfect, hitting the hostile target in the head and leaving the civilian unharmed. Her time, 3 minutes, 42 seconds. Webb emerged from his section 30 seconds later, confident and grinning. His smile faded when he saw the scoreboard. "That's impossible," he muttered, staring at Zariah's time. "You were using iron sights. Equipment malfunction," Zariah said quietly. "Had to adapt." Word of her performance spread quickly through the gathered competitors. As she walked between stations, Zariah could feel eyes following her, hear whispered conversations that stopped when she got too close. Colonel Harrow watched from an elevated platform, his expression unreadable. Gideon Hale appeared at her elbow as she studied the schedule for the next challenge. "Impressive shooting," he said. "Where'd you train?" "Here and there." "That's not really an answer." Zariah looked at him directly for the first time. Up close, she could see the family resemblance to Sophie, but where Sophie's eyes held intelligence and curiosity, Gideon's were cold and calculating. "It's the only one you're getting." That evening, after the other competitors had left, Zariah remained behind. She'd noticed during the day that certain areas of the facility were off limits, marked with signs reading, "Authorized personnel only," and guarded by men who weren't wearing competitor numbers. Using skills she'd learned in places that didn't officially exist, Zariah made her way into the main building through a side window. The interior hallways were dimly lit, and she moved silently toward what appeared to be the administrative section. The first office she checked contained standard paperwork, membership files, and financial records, but the second office, marked with Colonel Harrow's nameplate, was more interesting. The desk was locked, but Zariah had tools for that problem. Inside the main drawer, she found contracts with names she didn't recognize and purchase orders for, equipment that seemed excessive for a shooting club. But it was the encrypted thumb drive taped to the underside of the drawer that really caught her attention. She photographed everything she could and pocketed the thumb drive. As she prepared to leave, footsteps in the hallway forced her to hide behind a filing cabinet. 2 men entered, their voices low but audible. "The Monroe woman is becoming a problem," one said. "She's not supposed to be this good," Harrow says, To let her advance, he wants to see how far she'll push. And then? Then we deal with her permanently. After they left, Zariah waited 10 minutes before making her way out of the building. But instead of heading home, she followed the sound of vehicles moving in the darkness beyond the main facility. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Hidden, behind a stand of cottonwood trees, was a structure that looked like a wine cellar from the outside. But the men carrying wooden crates down into it weren't handling bottles of Merlot. Through a gap in the partially open doors, Zariah caught sight of military-grade weapons, ammunition, and equipment that definitely wasn't legal for civilian ownership. Custom suppressors, foreign manufacturer stamps, weapons that belonged in war zones, not Arizona shooting clubs. She took photos with a small camera she'd hidden in her jacket, then carefully backed away. Whatever was happening at Copper Barrel went far beyond weekend competitions and good old boy networking. Meanwhile, Sophie was having her own revelation. Her suspicions about the club had been growing for months, especially after some of Gideon's recent behavior. He'd been more secretive, more prone to violent outbursts, and definitely had more money than his instructor's salary should provide. She cornered him after dinner at their shared childhood home, a modest ranch house where they'd both moved back to care for their aging father. "Gideon, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." Her brother looked up from the television, annoyed at being interrupted during a football game. "What? Is the club involved in anything illegal? What kind of question is that?" "The kind that deserves an answer. You've been different lately, more secretive, and there's no way you're making the kind of money you've been spending on that instructor's salary." Gideon's expression hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know you've been participating in competitions that aren't advertised to regular members. I know some of the people coming and going from that place look more like mercenaries than sportsmen, and I know you've been lying to me about what really goes on there." "Drop it, Sophie." "I can't drop it. Not when I think you might be in over your head." Gideon stood up, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where Zariah had noticed he always carried a concealed pistol. "I said drop it. Some things are bigger than your need to know every detail of my life." But Sophie wasn't intimidated. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. Using a small recording device she'd bought online, she planted a bug in Gideon's gear bag. 3 days later, Sophie sat in her car in the Walmart parking lot, listening to the recording. Through earbuds, what she heard made her stomach turn. Gideon's voice, discussing what sounded like assassination contracts, references to cleanups and loose ends, and then, clear as day, a name that made her blood freeze. Monroe. The Monroe situation needs to be resolved before she digs any deeper, Gideon was saying. She's already gotten past the first 2 barriers. If she makes it to the final challenge, then we eliminate her during the event, another voice responded. It sounded like Colonel Harrow. Make it look like an accident, equipment malfunction. These things happen in high-stress competitions. Sophie yanked out the earbuds and stared at the recorder. They were planning to kill Zariah. Whatever secrets the club was hiding, they were worth murdering to protect. Meanwhile, back in her trailer, Zariah was having more success with the encrypted thumb drive. Using software she'd acquired through channels that weren't entirely legal, she'd managed to crack the encryption and access the files. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. The drive contained a detailed file labeled Operation Condor Domestic Cleansing. It outlined a network of private military contractors operating within the United States, using shooting clubs and veteran organizations as cover for weapons, trafficking, political assassinations, and what could only be described as domestic terrorism operations. Her old unit, Taskwind Zero, was listed under a section titled Neutralized Assets. The file detailed how her team had been classified as compromised due to potential whistleblower activity, and subsequently eliminated through friendly fire incident during Operation Desert Crown. The order had been signed by Colonel Harrow. But the most chilling discovery was in a subfolder labeled Current Targets. Her own name was listed as pending termination, with a date that made her hands shake. This Sunday, the day of the final Elite Trials Challenge. The next morning, Zariah went to Henderson's gun shop with a specific purpose. Ray looked up as she entered, and she could see in his eyes that he'd been expecting her. "You found what you were looking for," he said. It wasn't a question, some of it. Ray locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. "I've been waiting for someone like you to come along, someone who could get inside that place and find the truth." "You knew?" "Suspected. My nephew was a good kid, served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Came back different like they all do, but he was trying to get his life together. Started going to Copper Barrel, said they had programs for veterans." Ray's voice grew quiet. "Found him dead in the desert 6 months later. Sheriff said it was suicide, but I know my nephew. He wouldn't have done that." Ray walked to the back of the shop and returned with a rifle case. This belonged to him. He'd want it used for the right purpose. Inside the case was a precision rifle that had been modified far beyond civilian specifications. The scope alone was worth more than most people's cars. "They've got you set up to die on Sunday," Ray continued. "But maybe, with the right equipment, you can turn the tables." That afternoon, Zariah discovered just how deep the corruption went. She'd stopped by the sheriff's office to test whether she could trust local law enforcement with what she'd learned. Sheriff Brody, a large man with a permanently skeptical expression, listened to her story with what appeared to be genuine concern. "That's quite an accusation, Miss Monroe," he said when she finished. "These are serious allegations against some prominent citizens. I have evidence. Well then, why don't you come with me and we'll sort this whole thing out?" But instead of leading her to an interrogation room, Sheriff Brody led her to a holding cell. As the door clanged shut behind her, he smiled. "Colonel Harrow sends his regards," he said. "He's looking forward to Sunday's competition. Shame you won't be able to participate." Zariah had been in the cell for 6 hours when Sophie appeared. She was accompanied by a woman Zariah didn't recognize, someone with short gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military background. "This is Major Patricia Collins, retired Army intelligence," Sophie said as Collins worked on the cell lock with tools that were definitely not standard issue. "She's been investigating Copper Barrel for the better part of a year." "How did you know I was here?" Zariah asked as the lock clicked open. "Small town. Word travels fast when someone gets arrested for disturbing the peace," Sophie replied. "Plus I heard the recording of my brother planning your murder." As they left the sheriff's office through a back exit, Collins filled Zariah in on what she'd learned. Operation Condor is bigger than just Copper Barrel. There are facilities like this in 12 states, all run by the same network. They're using veteran organizations and shooting clubs to recruit operatives for black market operations. "And my team? Your team discovered part of the network during your deployment. They were eliminated because they were about to expose the whole operation." Collins looked at her directly. "You were supposed to die with them. The fact that you survived made you a loose end that needed to be tied up." That evening, in Sophie's house, they planned their next move. The final challenge was in 2 days, and Zariah was determined to be there. "It's suicide," Sophie argued. "They're planning to kill you during the competition. Then I'll have to make sure I win fast enough that they don't get the chance." "You're talking about taking on an entire organization. These aren't just weekend shooters. Some of these men are former special forces, intelligence operatives, career military." Zariah was cleaning Ray's rifle, her movements sure and practiced. "I was special forces too, and I have something they don't." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose." Collins had been quiet during most of the planning, but now she spoke up. "There might be a way to expose them publicly. If we can broadcast the final challenge, show the world what's really happening there." "How?" "Sophie has access to the facility as Gideon's sister. She can plant cameras, set up a live stream to media contacts I have in Washington. If we can get footage of the weapons cache, the assassination attempt, maybe even get Harrow or one of the others to admit their involvement on camera." Sophie nodded slowly. "It could work, but we'd only get one chance." "Then we better make it count." The night before the final challenge, Zariah made a phone call she'd been putting off for 3 years. Her father answered on the second ring. "Zariah? Jesus, girl, where have you been?" "I'm sorry, Dad. I know I should have called. Your mother's been worried sick. We heard about Syria, about what happened to your team. We tried to find you, but the army said you'd been discharged and they couldn't give us any information. Zariah closed her eyes. Her father had been a Marine, served 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd understand better than most what she was about to do. Dad, I need you to know something. If I don't make it through the next few days, I want you to tell Mom that I did what I had to do, that I didn't let them get away with it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When her father spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. You found the bastards who killed your team. Yeah. You be careful, baby girl. But you finish what they started. I will. And Zariah, I'm proud of you. I should have said that 3 years ago. The final challenge was announced the next morning. Legacy Shot. A one-on-one precision shooting duel between Zariah and Gideon Hale. The event would take place at sunset, on the long-range course overlooking the desert. Colonel Harrow made the announcement personally, his smile cold and satisfied. It'll be a friendly competition, of course. May the best shooter win. But as Zariah checked her equipment one final time, she knew there was nothing friendly about what was coming. This was war, and only one side was going to walk away alive. Sophie activated the hidden cameras she'd placed throughout the facility. In Washington, Major Collins's media contacts were standing by to receive the live stream, and in the desert outside Stratton, a ghost was about to settle a score that had been 3 years in the making. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert. Zariah took her position, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle in her hands. Across the field, Gideon was doing the same. Between them lay the truth about Syria, about her team, and about a conspiracy that reached deeper into the American military than either of them had imagined. The only question now was who would be left standing to tell the story. The desert air was still and heavy as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The Legacy Shot had drawn a smaller crowd than the earlier challenges, just the core members of Copper Barrel's inner circle, and a handful of competitors who'd earned the right to witness the final confrontation. They gathered on a raised platform overlooking the long-range course, their voices hushed with anticipation. Sophie crouched in the communications tower, her hands trembling slightly as she activated the final camera. The live stream was all ready, broadcasting to Major Collins' contacts in Washington, and she could see the viewer count climbing steadily as word spread through military forums and encrypted journalist channels. Hidden cameras throughout the facility were capturing everything, from the weapons vault she'd managed to access earlier to the faces of every conspirator present. System is live, she whispered into her hidden microphone. All feeds active. 200 yards below, Zariah and Gideon took their positions on opposite ends of the shooting course. The setup was deceptively simple, a series of steel targets at varying distances, from 300 to 800 yards. Each shooter would engage the targets in sequence, with points awarded for accuracy and speed. The first to complete the course would be declared the winner. What the official rules didn't mention was that this wasn't intended to be a competition with 2 survivors. Gideon approached Zariah before the final equipment check, his rifle slung casually across his shoulder. Up close, she could see the family resemblance to Sophie more clearly, but where Sophie's eyes held warmth and intelligence, Gideon's were cold as winter steel. I want you to know something before we start, he said, his voice low enough that the spectators couldn't hear. I was there, Syria. I watched them burn. The words hit Zariah like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. In her mind, she was back in that desert, watching through her scope as the building that held her team erupted in flames. You gave the coordinates, she said. It wasn't a question. I followed orders, just like I'm following orders now. Gideon's smile was cruel. They told me you were dead. Should have stayed that way. The memory came flooding back with crystal clarity. Captain Bradley's voice over the radio. Ground floor is clear, moving to second level. The heat signatures on the third floor that never moved, because they'd been corpses planted to draw her team into the kill zone. The airstrike that came not from enemy forces, but from their own command. Zariah saw herself again on that rooftop, helpless, screaming into the radio as her family burned below. She saw herself later, in the debriefing room, as Colonel Harrow. explained how her faulty intelligence had led to the tragedy. She saw the discharge papers, the psychological evaluation, the systematic destruction of everything she'd believed in. They were good soldiers, she said quietly. They were loose ends. Just like you. Colonel Harrow's voice cut through the desert air, amplified by a portable loudspeaker. Gentlemen and ladies, welcome to the Legacy Shot. Our competitors today represent the finest traditions of precision marksmanship and tactical excellence. The crowd applauded politely. Sophie zoomed in one of the cameras on Harrow's face, making sure the stream captured every word. The rules are simple, Harrow continued. First shooter to successfully engage all targets wins. In the event of a tie, sudden death rules apply. He paused, his eyes finding Zariah across the distance. May the best soldier prevail. Zariah moved to her firing position and began her pre-shot routine. She checked the rifle Ray had given her, adjusting the scope and testing the bolt action. Everything felt solid, reliable. As she settled into position, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The gas system on her rifle had been tampered with. Someone had loosened a critical component, not enough to cause an immediate malfunction, but enough to create a dangerous pressure buildup after several rounds. The rifle would likely explode in her hands by the fourth or fifth shot. Working quickly and as discreetly as possible, she used a paperclip from her pocket and gun oil from her bootlace to make a field repair. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold long enough. First target, 300 yards, the range officer announced. Gideon fired first, his shot ringing out across the desert. The steel target sang as the bullet struck home. A solid hit, but slightly off. Center. Zariah steadied herself, controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger. Her shot struck dead center, the metallic ping echoing off the canyon walls. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Second target, 450 yards. Again, Gideon fired. First, another hit, this one closer to center mass. He was good, Zariah had to admit. His military training showed in every movement, every breath. When Zariah fired, her bullet struck the exact center of the target. The murmur from the crowd grew louder. Colonel Harrow's jaw visibly tightened. In the communications tower, Sophie was providing running commentary for the stream viewers. Target 2, perfect shot from Monroe. Harrow doesn't look happy about this. Third target, 600 yards. The wind had picked up slightly, and both shooters had to compensate. Gideon took his time, adjusting for the crosswind before firing. A good shot, but the wind had pushed it slightly to the left. Zariah felt the desert, breeze on her face, calculated the wind speed and direction, and made her adjustment. Her shot was perfect, striking the target with a sound like a bell. One spectator began to clap, then caught himself and stopped. The tension in the air was becoming palpable. Fourth target, 700 yards. This was where the real skill separated the good shooters from the great ones. At 700 yards, factors like bullet drop, wind drift, and even the rotation of the earth began to matter. Gideon's shot was respectable, hitting the target but well off center. Zariah's shot was a thing of beauty, striking the precise center of the steel plate with a resonant clang that seemed to hang in the desert air longer than physically possible. Final target, 800 yards. Colonel Harrow had moved closer to the shooting line, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Sophie caught this on camera, zooming in to show viewers the clear threat. Gideon lined up his final shot, taking longer than he had for any of the previous targets. When he fired, the bullet struck the target, but it was clearly off-center. He'd been rattled by Zariah's perfect performance, and it showed. As Zariah prepared for her final shot, she could hear whispered conversations from the spectators. They'd expected her to be eliminated by now, either through poor performance or equipment failure. The fact that she was not only still shooting but dominating the competition had clearly unsettled them. She settled into position, found her natural point of aim, and began her breathing cycle. In the scope, the target looked impossibly small, a tiny steel rectangle shimmering in the heat waves rising from the desert floor. The shot broke clean and true. Even at 800 yards, The sound of the bullet striking dead center was audible to everyone present. Silence fell over the gathering. Zariah had not only won the competition, she dominated it in a way that left no doubt about her superior skill. Colonel Harrow stepped forward, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "Congratulations, Miss Monroe, quite an impressive display." "Thank you, sir. However, I believe a sudden death tiebreaker is in order. One final shot, both competitors, to determine the true winner. Sir, the competition rules were clear. First to complete the course wins." Harrow's hand moved closer to his sidearm. "I'm changing the rules. Final shot determines the winner. 900 yards, simultaneous fire." The crowd began to murmur. Even they could see that this was no longer about competition. This was about something else entirely. "If you insist," Zariah said calmly. But as they moved to the new firing positions, she could see Gideon making hand signals to several men in the crowd. The setup was becoming clear. Win or lose, she wasn't supposed to leave this desert alive. The 900-yard target was barely visible even through a high-powered scope. At that distance, a perfect shot required not just skill, but a deep understanding of ballistics, environmental factors, and the particular characteristics of the rifle being used. "On my mark," Harrow announced. "Both shooters will fire simultaneously. Best shot wins." Zariah settled into position, but instead of aiming at the distant target, she made a different calculation. Through her scope, she could see Gideon's position. Clearly, she could also see the armed men who had quietly moved to surround the shooting area. "Ready," Harrow called out. Zariah shifted her aim slightly. "Fire!" 2 shots rang out simultaneously, but while Gideon's bullet sailed harmlessly past the 900-yard target, Zariah had aimed at something else entirely. Her bullet struck Gideon's rifle just forward of the action, shattering the stock and sending the weapon flying from his hands. He rolled away, reaching for his sidearm, but Zariah was already moving. "That's enough," she shouted, loud enough for Sophie's cameras to pick up clearly. "No more games, no more lies." Colonel Harrow drew his pistol, but Zariah was faster. She put a round into the dirt at his feet, close enough to spray him with sand and stone fragments. "I said enough." She swung her rifle toward the crowd, where several men were reaching for their own weapons. "Everyone stops moving, or the next shot won't be a warning." The desert fell silent except for the wind. From her position in the communications tower, Sophie could see the viewer count on the live stream climbing rapidly. What had started as a few dozen viewers had grown to hundreds, then thousands. Military forums were buzzing with activity, and several major news networks had apparently picked up the feed. "This is going out live to half the country," she whispered into her microphone, knowing that Major Collins would relay the message to the appropriate people. On the shooting range, Zariah kept her rifle trained on the crowd while she spoke. 3 years ago, my unit was murdered in Syria, not by enemy forces, by our own command, because we discovered something we weren't supposed to know." "You're talking nonsense," Colonel Harrow said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Operation Condor," Zariah continued, her voice carrying across the desert. "A domestic terrorism network using veteran organizations as cover for weapons trafficking and political assassinations. 12 facilities across the United States. All run by the same people who murdered my team." She could see the shock on some faces in the crowd. Not everyone present was part of the conspiracy. Some were legitimate competitors who'd been unknowingly participating in a cover operation. "The evidence is already in the hands of federal authorities," Zariah said. "Financial records, weapons inventories, communication logs, everything you thought you'd buried." Colonel Harrow's composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. This operation serves national security interests that go beyond your limited understanding. Murdering American soldiers serves national security? Your unit was compromised. They were going to expose classified operations to enemy forces. My unit discovered that you were selling weapons to the same insurgents we were fighting. They were going to report that American soldiers were dying because of guns you put in terrorist hands. The accusation hung in the desert air, like a physical presence. Several of the legitimate competitors began backing away from the platform, finally understanding that they'd stumbled into something far beyond a shooting competition. But Colonel Harrow wasn't finished. Even if that were true, what makes you think you'll live long enough to see justice done? He made a subtle hand gesture, and Zariah saw armed men beginning to move in from multiple directions. She'd expected this, but that didn't make the situation any less dangerous. "Because I'm not alone," she said. That's when Carlos Vega, one of the competitors Zariah had observed during the earlier challenges, stepped forward with his rifle in his hands. Unlike the others, he wasn't aiming at Zariah. He was covering her. "Back. This ain't what we signed up for," Vega said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded men in combat. "I served 3 tours to protect this country, not to be part of some shadow operation murdering our own people." 2 other competitors joined him, their weapons trained on Harrow's men rather than on Zariah. The crowd was fracturing, with the legitimate members finally understanding the true nature of what they'd been participating in. "Stand down," Harrow shouted, but his authority was evaporating by the moment. That's when Sheriff Brody made his move. He'd been positioned near the rear of the crowd, probably as backup security for the operation. Now he drew his service weapon and began moving toward Zariah. She saw him coming and made a split-second decision. Instead of shooting the sheriff, she put a bullet through the support post of the observation platform. The structure groaned and began to collapse, sending spectators scrambling for safety and creating chaos that disrupted whatever coordinated attack Harrow had planned. In the confusion, Gideon managed to reach a backup rifle someone had dropped. He brought it to his shoulder, aiming at Zariah, but before he could fire, his own sister's voice rang out across the desert. "Gideon, stop!" Sophie had left the communications tower and was standing in the open, her hands raised, but her voice, carrying absolute authority. "It's over. The whole world is watching. If you pull that trigger, you'll be murdering someone in front of thousands of witnesses." For a moment, brother and sister stared at each other across the battlefield that the shooting range had become. In Gideon's eyes, Zariah could see the war between his loyalty to the operation and his love for his family. The moment stretched until it seemed to break under its own weight. Then, Gideon lowered his rifle. "Smart choice," Zariah said. But she kept her own weapon ready, because Colonel Harrow was still armed and still dangerous. "This isn't over," Harrow snarled. "You think exposing one facility will stop this? We have resources you can't imagine. Connections that reach into the highest levels of government." "Maybe," Zariah replied. "But you don't have your weapons vault anymore." As if on cue, an explosion echoed across the desert from the direction of the hidden bunker. Smoke began rising from behind the cottonwood trees, black and thick against the orange sunset sky. "What did you do?" Harrow demanded. "I made sure the evidence would be available for federal investigators, along with a few insurance policies in case something happened to me." The explosion had been Sophie's work. While everyone was focused on the shooting competition, she'd used thermite charges that Major Collins had provided to destroy the weapons cache. Not to eliminate the evidence, but to make sure it couldn't be moved before authorities arrived. But Harrow wasn't finished. Even with his operation exposed and his authority crumbling, he still had one card left to play. Moving faster than Zariah would have expected from a man his age, he grabbed a young competitor who'd been standing nearby and put his pistol to the man's head. "Here's how this is going to work," he said, his voice deadly calm despite the chaos around him. "You're going to put down that rifle and walk away. In exchange, this young man gets to see his family again." The hostage was maybe 25 years old, probably a veteran trying to find community and purpose in civilian life. His eyes were wide with terror, but he was trying to remain calm. "Let him go," Zariah said. "This is between us." "No, this is about national security and the greater good. Sometimes innocent people have to die to protect the mission." "Like my team died?" "Exactly like your team died." In her earpiece, Zariah could hear Sophie providing updates to the live stream viewers. Thousands of people were watching this standoff play out in real time. The pressure to resolve it without bloodshed was enormous. But Zariah had been in similar situations before, in places where the rules of engagement were written in blood and sand. She understood that sometimes the only way to save lives was to risk everything on a single perfect shot. "Colonel," she said, her voice carrying across the desert, "you're right about one thing. Sometimes people have to die for the greater good. She fired. The bullet took Colonel Harrow in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to release his hostage. The young man dove for cover while Harrow stumbled backward, his pistol flying from his hand. Zariah could have killed him. At that distance, with that rifle, she could have put the bullet anywhere she wanted. But she'd chosen to wound rather than kill, because unlike the men she was fighting, she still believed in justice over revenge. Harrow fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Around him, his remaining supporters were laying down their weapons as the reality of their situation became clear. "It's over," Zariah said, but she kept her rifle ready. That's when they heard the helicopters. Federal agents were already in the air, having been alerted by Major Collins the moment the live stream began broadcasting. The FBI, DEA, and military investigators had been coordinating their response, waiting for enough evidence to move against the entire network. The stream had given them everything they needed, as the helicopters settled in the desert beyond the shooting range. Kicking up clouds of dust and sand, Zariah finally allowed herself to lower her rifle. She thought about Captain Bradley, about Sergeants Collins and Parker, about Specialists Morrison and Hayes. She thought about the promises she'd made to their memory and the justice she'd sworn to find. It wasn't complete. It would never be complete. Her team was still dead, and no amount of evidence or arrest would bring them back. But it was a beginning. Sheriff Brody tried to make one last move, probably hoping to escape in the confusion of the federal raid. But Carlos Vega and the other legitimate competitors had formed a loose perimeter, making sure none of the conspirators could slip away. As FBI agents swarmed the facility, Zariah walked over to where Gideon knelt beside his wounded commanding officer. "You could have killed him," Gideon said, not looking up. "I'm not like you," Zariah replied. "I don't murder people to cover up my mistakes." For the first time since she'd arrived in Stratton, Gideon met her eyes directly. What she saw there wasn't hatred or defiance. It was something that might have been shame. "They told us you were a traitor," he said quietly. "That your unit was going to sell intelligence to enemy forces. And you believed them?" "I wanted to believe them. It made the killing easier." Sophie appeared at Zariah's side, her camera still recording everything for posterity. "The stream reached over 1 million viewers," she said. "Every major news network is picking up the story. By tomorrow morning, everyone in the country will know about Operation Condor." Zariah nodded, but she was watching the federal agents work. They moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd been planning this operation for a long time. Major Collins emerged from one of the helicopters, directing teams toward the weapons vault and the main building. "You did it," Sophie continued. "You exposed them all." "We did it," Zariah corrected. "I couldn't have done this alone." As the sun finally disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Zariah allowed herself a moment to feel something that might have been peace. It wasn't the peace of closure, because there would always be more battles to fight and more wrongs to right. But it was the peace of knowing that her team's sacrifice hadn't been in vain, and that their killers would finally face justice. In the POW distance, she could see Colonel Harrow being loaded into a medical helicopter under heavy guard. Gideon and the other conspirators were being processed by federal agents, their hands secured with zip ties, their futures reduced to orange jumpsuits and prison cells. The weapons vault was still smoking, but teams of investigators were already documenting everything they could recover. Financial records, communication logs, and membership lists were being seized as evidence in what would become one of the largest domestic terrorism prosecutions in American history. "What happens now?" Sophie asked. Zariah looked out over the desert, toward the lights of Stratton twinkling in the growing darkness. "Now we let the system work, and we make sure the world remembers what happened here." She picked up her rifle and began walking toward her truck. Behind her, the federal investigation was just beginning. Ahead of her, the road stretched into the darkness, leading toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in 3 years, it was a future she wanted to see. 6 months had passed since the desert showdown that brought down Copper Barrel, and the autumn wind carried a different kind of chill through the military cemetery outside Arlington. Sophie pulled her coat tighter as she approached the section reserved for classified operations, where 5 simple white headstones bore only numbers instead of names. She knelt and placed a bouquet of desert wildflowers on the center grave, the one that would have belonged to Captain Bradley if his identity hadn't been classified beyond recognition. The small bronze plaque she'd fought to have installed read simply, "Taskwind Zero, they served with honor." "She made sure you were remembered," Sophie whispered to the silent stones. "It took 3 years, but she made sure." The legal proceedings had been swift once the evidence was presented. The live stream footage, combined with the documents recovered from the destroyed weapons vault and Zariah's encrypted files, had provided federal prosecutors with an airtight case. Operation Condor had been larger than anyone imagined, with tentacles reaching into private military contractors, veteran organizations, and even some legitimate government agencies. Sophie's phone buzzed with a text from Lena Wu, the investigative journalist who'd become the unofficial chronicler of the Copper Barrel story. "Documentary airs tonight. You watching?" Sophie typed back. "Wouldn't miss it." That evening, she settled into her apartment with a cup of coffee and turned on her television. The documentary titled "The Barrel of Lies Inside America's Shadow." War had been 6 months in the making. Lena had interviewed dozens of people, from federal investigators to family members of Operation Condor's victims, but the centerpiece was the footage Sophie herself had captured during those final, violent hours in the desert. The documentary opened with images from the live stream, showing Zariah's perfect shots during the legacy shot competition. Lena's narration was measured and professional, but Sophie could hear the underlying anger that had driven her investigation. What began as a story about a shooting competition became an expose of domestic terrorism operating under the cover of patriotism, Lena said as the camera panned across surveillance photos of the various Copper Barrel facilities that had been raided simultaneously across 12 states. The documentary included excerpts from Gideon's prison interviews. In the months since his arrest, he'd become unexpectedly cooperative with investigators, providing details about Operation Condor's structure and financing that had helped authorities dismantle the entire network. "I told myself I was following orders," Gideon said in the interview, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the tactical gear he'd worn during his Copper Barrel days. "But orders to murder American soldiers aren't legitimate orders. They're war crimes." Sophie found herself crying as she watched her brother's confession. The Gideon she'd grown up with had been a good person, if naive and easily influenced. Seeing him take responsibility for his actions, even from prison, gave her hope that some part of that good person still existed. The documentary also featured interviews with Carlos Vega and the other legitimate competitors who'd found themselves caught up in the conspiracy. They'd formed an informal support group, helping each other process the trauma of discovering that their veteran community had been infiltrated by the very people they'd trusted to understand their military experience. "We thought we were joining a brotherhood," Vega said in his interview. "Turns out we were being recruited for a terrorist organization." But it was the final segment of the documentary that hit Sophie hardest. Lena had somehow managed to track down family members of Zariah's fallen teammates, the soldiers who died in Syria believing they were serving their country. Their stories, told through tears and old photographs, gave faces and names to the victims of Operation Condor's conspiracy. Captain Bradley's widow spoke about how she'd never been given a clear explanation of her husband's death, only told that it was classified. Sergeant Collins' parents described their son's dreams of becoming a teacher after his military service ended. Specialist Morrison's sister talked about how her brother had planned to use his military training to become a police officer in their small hometown. These weren't just casualties of war. They were specific, deliberate murders committed to protect a criminal enterprise that wrapped itself in the flag while betraying everything that flag represented. As the documentary ended with footage of Colonel Harrow being led away in shackles, Sophie felt her phone ring. The number was unlisted, but she answered anyway. "Hello? Sophie? It's me." Sophie's heart stopped. She hadn't heard from Zariah since the week after the arrests, when they'd both been required to give testimony to federal investigators. Zariah had disappeared after that, leaving only a brief note saying she needed time to process everything. That had happened. Zariah, where are you? I've been worried sick. I'm safe. I saw the documentary. Lena did good work. Where are you? Sophie asked again. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can think. There was a pause. I wanted to thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. You saved my brother's soul, Sophie replied. He's writing a book. In prison, telling the whole truth about what he did. He says he wants to make sure no one else makes his mistakes. Good. That's good. Another pause, longer this time. Sophie, I need you to know that I'm okay. Different, but okay. For the first time in 3 years, I can sleep without dreaming about that building burning in Syria. Will I see you again? Maybe. Someday. When the world needs fewer ghosts and more people willing to stand in the light. The line went quiet, and Sophie realized Zariah had hung up. Meanwhile, across the country, federal prosecutors were preparing for what they'd already dubbed the trial of the century. Colonel Harrow had been indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to weapons trafficking to violations of the Espionage Act. His lawyers were arguing that he'd been operating under legitimate national security authority, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution team included some of the Justice Department's most experienced attorneys, along with military prosecutors who understood the specific nature of Harrow's crimes. Major Collins, now retired from active duty, served as a special consultant, helping them understand the complex web of relationships and cover-ups that had protected Operation Condor for so long. The trial was held in federal court in Washington, with unprecedented security measures. The defendant was a former colonel with connections throughout the military-industrial complex, and several of his co-conspirators had already been found dead in their cells under suspicious circumstances. Gideon testified for the prosecution, his detailed knowledge of Operation Condor's day-to-day operations proving invaluable. Under cross-examination, Harrow's defense attorneys tried to portray him as a low-level operative who'd been manipulated by his superiors, but the evidence contradicted their narrative. Did you personally falsify the intelligence reports that led to the airstrike on Taskwind Zero? The prosecutor asked. Yes, Gideon replied, his voice steady despite the weight of the admission. And did Colonel Harrow specifically order you to provide false coordinates for that airstrike? Yes. He told me that the unit had been compromised and needed to be eliminated before they could reveal classified information to enemy forces. Did you believe that to be true? Gideon was quiet for a long moment before answering. I wanted to believe it was true. But I knew, in my heart, that we were murdering our own people to protect a criminal enterprise. The trial lasted 3 weeks. When the jury returned their verdict, Colonel Harrow was found guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his crimes represented a betrayal of the oath every military officer takes to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But even with Harrow's conviction, the story wasn't over. The Operation Condor network had been extensive, and rooting out all of its connections was proving to be a years-long process. Sophie found herself testifying before congressional committees, helping lawmakers understand how such a conspiracy could have operated undetected for so long. She also found herself writing. What had started as personal journals processing her experience became something larger, a comprehensive account of how Operation Condor had recruited and radicalized veterans, and how it had been ultimately exposed. Blood in the Brass. The Zariah Monroe Files became a bestseller within weeks of its publication. Sophie donated half the proceeds to organizations supporting veteran mental health, and the other half to a scholarship fund for the children of Taskwind Zero's fallen members. The dedication page read simply, "For those who were erased, and for the ghost who brought them back to light." On the first anniversary of the Copper Barrel raid, the town of Stratton held a memorial service. The ceremony was small and private, attended mostly by locals who'd known nothing about the conspiracy until it was exposed. The site of the former shooting club had been turned into a desert wildlife preserve, with a simple granite marker commemorating the federal agents and local heroes who'd brought the truth to light. Sophie attended the service, along with Carlos, Vega, and several other former competitors who'd been unwitting participants in Operation Condor's cover story. As the sun set over the desert where so much violence had taken place, they shared stories and tried to make sense of how their lives had been forever changed by those explosive few hours. "You think she'll ever come back?" Vega asked as they prepared to leave. Sophie looked out over the desert, where a lone figure stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, too far away to identify but somehow familiar in posture and bearing. "She never really left," Sophie said, quietly. The courtroom in Tunisia was small and oppressively hot, with ancient ceiling fans that did little more than move the stale air around. Colonel Harrow sat in chains at the defendant's table, his once imposing presence diminished by months of imprisonment and the orange jumpsuit that marked him as an international fugitive. The charges against him in the international court were different from those he'd faced in the United States. Here, he was being prosecuted for war crimes, specifically for his role in supplying weapons to terrorist organizations and for ordering the execution of American soldiers who discovered his activities. Zariah sat in the gallery, wearing sunglasses and a simple dress that made her blend in with the other observers. She'd been following Harrow's extradition and trial from a distance, never testifying, but always watching as justice slowly, methodically caught up with the man who destroyed her life. The proceedings were conducted in Arabic, French, and English, with translators providing real-time interpretation. Zariah understood enough Arabic to follow most of the testimony without translation, a skill she'd acquired during her deployment years ago. When a journalist approached her during a recess, asking if she was the famous Zariah Monroe, she simply smiled and said, "I think you have me confused with someone else." But that evening, alone in her modest hotel room, she allowed herself to watch the news coverage of the trial. The reporter was discussing how Harrow's conviction in the United States had led to international investigations, revealing that Operations Condor had been part of a larger network of illegal arms dealers and mercenary organizations. The woman known as Zariah Monroe, whose investigation led to the exposure of the conspiracy, has not been seen publicly since the trials ended, the reporter said. Some speculate that she's entered witness protection, while others believe she's simply chosen to disappear. Zariah turned off the television and walked to the window overlooking the Mediterranean. In the distance, she could see fishing boats returning to harbor, their lights twinkling like stars on the dark water. She thought about the path that had brought her here, from that terrible day in Syria, through the violence in the Arizona desert, to this quiet moment of watching justice finally being served. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she recognized but hadn't spoken to in over a year. "Hello, Dad." "Zariah." Her father's voice was weaker than she remembered, aged by illness and worry. "I've been watching the news about the trial. Yeah, I'm proud of you, kid. Your mother would have been proud too." Zariah closed her eyes. Her mother had died 6 months ago, during the height of the federal investigations. Zariah had wanted to attend the funeral, but the ongoing legal proceedings and security concerns had made it impossible. It was one of many sacrifices she'd made in pursuit of justice. "I should have been there," she said. "You were exactly where you needed to be, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves." Her father coughed, a harsh sound that spoke of serious illness. "I need to tell you something. The doctors say I don't have much time left." "Dad, let me finish. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty or to rush home. I'm telling you because I want you to know that whatever you choose to do with the rest of your life, you've already made me prouder than any father has a right to be." They talked for another hour, about memories and regrets, about the future and the past. When Zariah finally hung up, she knew it would be the last time she heard her father's voice. 2 weeks later, she stood in a cemetery in Ohio, watching from a distance as her father was laid to rest with full military honors. She couldn't attend the service directly. Too many people knew her face now, and her presence would have created a media circus that would have dishonored her father's memory. But she was there, hidden among the trees at the edge of the cemetery, as the honor guard fired their rifles into the gray autumn sky. She was there when they folded the flag and presented it to her aunt, who'd served as the official next of kin. And she was there when the bugler played taps, the mournful notes echoing across the rows of white headstones. After the mourners left, She approached the grave alone. The headstone was simple. Master Sergeant James Monroe, United States Marine. Corpse, beloved father and patriot. I finished it, Dad, she said quietly. Just like you told me to. The wind rustled through the oak trees overhead, and for a moment, she could almost imagine it was her father's voice telling her that her work was done, that it was time to find peace. 6 months later, Zariah was living under a new name in a small town in Montana, working as a volunteer instructor at a youth outdoor program. The kids she taught were mostly from troubled backgrounds, young people who'd found themselves on the wrong side of the law and were looking for a second chance. One of her students was a 16-year-old girl named Maria, whose father had been killed in Afghanistan and whose mother was struggling with addiction. Maria had been caught breaking into cars, not for profit, but simply because she was angry at the world and didn't know how to express that anger constructively. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Maria asked one afternoon, as Zariah taught her proper rifle technique on the program's shooting range. "Because someone cared what happened to me when I was lost," Zariah replied, "and because you remind me of myself at your age. You were never a screw-up like me. I made plenty of mistakes. Some of them got good people killed." Zariah adjusted Maria's stance, helping her find the proper sight picture. The difference between a mistake and a failure is what you do afterward. What did you do afterward? I spent 3 years learning how to make things right. Maria's shot hit the target dead center, and her face lit up with an expression of pure accomplishment. In that moment, Zariah saw something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope for the future. That evening, she received an encrypted message on a secure communication app she'd thought was dormant. The message was from Sophie. "New development. You need to see this." Attached was a news article about a military tribunal that had just concluded in Washington. Several high-ranking officers who'd been connected to Operation Condor had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. More importantly, the tribunal had officially exonerated Taskwind Zero, acknowledging that the unit had been murdered to prevent them from exposing criminal activity. The exoneration came with official recognition of their service and sacrifice. Captain Bradley, Sergeants Collins and Parker, and Specialists Morrison and Hayes had all been posthumously awarded the Silver Star. Their families would finally receive the recognition and benefits they'd been denied for 3 years. But it was the final paragraph of the article that brought tears to Zariah's eyes. The military had announced plans for a permanent memorial to honor soldiers who died exposing corruption within their own ranks. It would be located at Arlington National Cemetery, and it would bear the names of Taskwind Zero's fallen members. Their names would finally be spoken again. 2 months later, Zariah stood at the edge of a different cemetery, this one in Arizona. The town of Stratton had erected a small memorial to commemorate the federal agents and local citizens who'd helped expose Operation Condor. At the center was a bronze statue of a figure kneeling with a rifle, the face deliberately obscured to represent all the unknown heroes who'd sacrificed for justice. The plaque at the base read, "For the quiet ones who stood tall, for those who never missed when it mattered." Sophie was there for the dedication ceremony, along with Carlos Vega and several other veterans who'd been unwittingly caught up in the conspiracy. Major Collins, now fully retired and working as a consultant for veteran advocacy organizations, delivered a speech about the importance of vigilance against those who would exploit the warrior ethos for criminal purposes. "The greatest threat to our military isn't foreign enemies," Collins said. "It's the corruption that can take root when good people choose to look the other way." After the ceremony, Sophie approached the bronze statue, where a woman in jeans and a baseball cap was standing with her back to the crowd. "You came," Sophie said. Zariah turned, and Sophie was struck by how different she looked. The haunted expression that had defined her features during their time in Stratton was gone, replaced by something that might have been peace. "I had to see it finished," Zariah said. "It is finished. Harrow got life without parole. The network's been dismantled. Your team's been honored. Their families taken care of. The military's paying full benefits, plus compensation for the years they were denied. Bradley's kids will have their college paid for." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as visitors approached the memorial to read the plaque and pay their respects. "What happens now?" Sophie asked. "Now I go back to my life. My real life." "Which is what exactly?" Zariah smiled, and for the first time since Sophie had known her, it reached her eyes. "Teaching kids that there's always another way, that violence should be the last resort, not the first. And if something like this happens again, if someone else needs a ghost to fight their battles?" Zariah looked out over the desert, where the setting sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Then someone else will have to step up. The world doesn't need Zariah Monroe anymore. It needs people willing to stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous." She handed Sophie a small envelope. "Give this to your brother when you visit him next." "What is it?" "Forgiveness. He's going to need it if he wants to build a new life when he gets out." Sophie watched as Zariah walked away, disappearing into the crowd of memorial visitors. When she opened the envelope, she found a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "The past doesn't have to define the future. Use your second chance wisely. Z." 6 months later, a story appeared in international news about a mysterious woman who'd won a precision shooting competition in Finland. The winner had competed under the name Samira Voss and had demonstrated skill levels that reminded some observers of the legendary Zariah Monroe. But when reporters tried to investigate further, they found no trace of anyone by that name. The competition organizers claimed their records had been corrupted, and security footage from the event had mysteriously disappeared. Some said it was just a coincidence. Others whispered that certain ghosts never really disappeared. They just found new ways to serve. In her final entry in the journal she'd kept throughout the investigation and trials, Sophie wrote, "Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a single breath before the trigger breaks. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to walk away from revenge and choose a different path. And sometimes it's the knowledge that somewhere in the world, someone is watching, ready to step out of the shadows when the innocent need protection." She closed the journal and put it in a safe deposit box, along with the original footage from the Copper Barrel raid and copies of all the evidence that had brought down Operation Condor. Someday, historians would want to study how a criminal conspiracy had nearly succeeded in corrupting American military institutions, and how it had been stopped by a woman who refused to let her fallen comrades be forgotten. But for now, the story was over. The ghost had found her peace. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, a young woman named Maria was learning that the best way to honor the dead was to help the living find their way to a better future. The final text appeared on screens across the country as the documentary's end credits rolled. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a single breath before the trigger breaks. Below that, scrolling slowly, were the names of real female veterans and whistleblowers whose service files had been redacted or classified, their sacrifices hidden from public view. The final frame faded to black with simple white text. "For those who served in silence. For those whose names we cannot speak. For those who stood guard in the darkness so others could live in the light." The end credits rolled to the sound of a single rifle shot echoing across an empty desert, where justice had finally found its mark. What would you do if you discovered that the very people you trusted to protect you were the ones who betrayed everything you believed in? And would you have the courage to stand alone against an entire system built on lies? Like and subscribe for more stories of ordinary people who refused to stay silent when it mattered most.